Greetings, my name is Indran Naidu. I'm the Director of the Independent Office of Evaluation of IFAD, and take this opportunity to welcome you all to this event. We also welcome the members of the Executive Board, IFAD management and technical staff, UNEG members, climate funding mechanisms, as well as experts and actors. Today's two-hour event is structured as follows. First, we have an overview of 15 minutes. IOE will briefly introduce the evaluation with the AVPs of PMD and SKD will briefly outline key elements of the management actions underway in response to this evaluation and how they plan to use this evaluation to deliver IFAD's climate change adaptation commitments under IFAD 12. Then we will have an explanation of the webinar protocols and participation. This will be done by IOE, our evaluation communication unit. In the main session, which is 40 minutes, the presentation of the highlights of the evaluation, key findings and recommendations will be made, followed by question and answer. And in the next session, part 2, we call it firing line, where the panel discussion around 3 key evaluation messages and question and answers, and then the wrap up. In terms of the thematic evaluation as a context, there is an urgent need to act on climate change. The IPCC report notes that the accelerating impacts of climate change and draw attention to the rapidly narrowing window of opportunities to act. Smallholder agriculture constitutes 75% of world's farms and is particularly vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. Agenda 2030 is a project cycle and halfway. Since it declared CCA as a corporate priority in 2010, IFAD has mobilized close to $500 million as climate finance for smallholder farmers, committed to integrate climate responses in all its country strategies and operations. IFAD 12 commits 40% of POLG to be directed towards climate finance. IFAD needed to take stock of what worked and why to pave way for an evidence-based way forward. Nanthi will talk to the comprehensive evaluation scope, but it must be acknowledged that this took place in the context of COVID-19, and methods were designed to overcome this and still ensure that we had coverage using technology to cover the unprecedented 20 country case studies for improved triangulation. The new evaluation policy emphasizes both accountability and learning, and in addition to the conclusions and recommendations, the report provides a wealth of evidence across a range of issues. For instance, an overview of the historic evolution of climate responses in IFAD, a comparison of related policies and approaches in selected IFIs and UN agencies, and analysis of lessons from all available scientific literature on what works, to name a few. In addition, drawing from the experience in 20 countries, the annexures provide an evidence-based analysis in a range of themes, such as scaling up, knowledge management, and environmental sustainability of climate responses, highlighting the good practices. These annexes provide rich information on the elements that make climate response more relevant, effective, and efficient. There's even an assessment of the quality of available GIS evidence in IFAD to assess climate response. We hope this evaluation, which is comprehensive, deemed credible by the advisors, is fully utilized by IFAD in moving forward and beyond. With that, allow me to have the privilege of handing over to opening remarks to Dr. Joe Puri, Associate Vice President, Strategy and Knowledge Department, IFAD, and Mr. Donald Brown, Associate Vice President for Program Management Department at IFAD, to make opening comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair, very much. Ladies and gentlemen, Executive Board members, IFAD Senior and Middle Management, regional climate and technical specialists, colleagues. Such a pleasure for me to be here today. As part of my opening remarks, I want to reflect on 3 key points I think that might be useful for all of us to consider as we go along, and for also hopefully to highlight as we have the very rich panel discussion that I'm anticipating at the end. I think the first point I wanted to talk about is how adaptation is crucial, and but that feasible solutions exist. The second, IFAD's own position within the field of climate adaptation. So that's the second point I want to talk about. And the third, very quickly, is the role of this independent evaluation, but of evaluative activities overall in helping us deal with, for example, impact washing. So with your permission, Chair, on the first one, we know that adaptation is crucial, but we also know that there are feasible solutions that exist. Currently, we need, according to different estimates, approximately $130 billion per year by 2030 for developing countries to meet all of their adaptation needs. But it's really important that we underscore that this 130 billion, 127 billion is all meant to be, according to the discussions that have gone on in the context of Paris as well as IPCC, are all meant to be new and additional climate finance and not repurposed climate finance, right? So that's really important, and that's one. And it also speaks to a later point I want to make about greenwashing or impact washing. Within this, we also know that the criticality of adaptation for countries in the South is disproportionately higher than countries in the North. And that's because of the levels of poverty and the lack of adaptive capacity. So while we know that a disproportionate, actually more than 90% of the emissions are coming from the global North, a disproportionate amount of the effect and the vulnerability that is caused is really being seen in developing countries. And that's where we have least ability to adapt. We also know in the context of IFAD that agriculture absorbs approximately 26% of the economic impact of climate disasters, and this rises to approximately more than 80% for drought in developing countries. Now, we're seeing the consequences of this, right? We're seeing, for example, that malnutrition and undernourishment especially is on the rise. We also know that there is a huge amount, that there is a magnitude increase in the overall amount of hunger that is being experienced by populations around the world. And we also know that even in this, even given that, yes, well, for hunger and for undernourishment, although climate and conflict and COVID are all coming together to amplify, I think, the impacts on nourishment as well as on hunger, what is also true is that the amount of additional global climate finance that's going into adaptation stays inexcusably low. So in 2019, 2020, for example, $632 billion were galvanized for global climate finance. But we know that for every $1 that was raised for adaptation, $12 were raised for mitigation. And it really speaks to the imbalance that we are witnessing despite a global commitment to really balance those two fund flows. And within developing countries, and a number that IFAD has really put out very, very extensively, the amount that is going to small-scale agricultural farmers is less than 2%. So it's really creating, I think what we're recognizing is that there's a huge demand in the context of adaptation. There is a huge amount of vulnerability and need, which is almost critical because it is the lack of adaptation was unfortunately going to lead to loss of lives and loss of livelihoods. But on the other side, we also don't have the ability currently to take action because of the meager resources that we have. The second point is really that IFAD has really established itself as a key player in climate adaptation. At COP26, IFAD, I think, really ossified its own space as a credible leader in climate adaptation. And now with COP27, we have the opportunity to further cement IFAD's reputation, to build partnerships, to mobilize greater resources. With ASAP, adaptation for smallholder farmers, we basically at the time, and even now, other than the adaptation fund, we are the larger assembler of finance in the adaptation space. And this is reflected in our corporate priorities as well. We are committed to ensuring that 40% of our core resources are dedicated to climate finance, with a majority, more than 90% of this actually going to climate adaptation. So, and this is really a breakaway from most of the other agencies that work in climate, because their ratios are actually the reverse. They spend a lot more on mitigation because it's more market ready, it's easy to leverage, and you can get a lot of scale, unlike IFAD, where IFAD is devoted very much to adaptation. And we are showing this also with the partnerships we are building with GCF, with the GEF, with the Adaptation Fund. We're aiming to mobilize up to $2 billion from climate funds by 2027. With ASAP, our ambition is large. We want to mobilize up to $500 million in adaptation finance for small-scale producers. And we want to ensure that all of this is also backed up by our commitment to credibility and measurement. And here, I think what I want to underscore is that while IFAD has established itself as a credible leader in adaptation, the two key areas, the three key areas, I beg your pardon, where we are really focusing on innovation, because clearly countries need that policy advice on adaptation, on scaling up, and on measurement. And last but not least, Chair, I do want to commend all of you on the evaluation report, but overall also to underscore the importance of doing the kind of work that we're going to hear of today and combine it with the kind of measurement that we also get from the impact assessment work that we do within management, as well as the kind of monitoring that we do within management, to really bring together critical mass of really good evidence that gives us unbiased analysis of what works, what doesn't, for whom, why, and how much, and really to avoid the kind of impact washing that we tend to see in most other places around the world. With that, I'm very much looking forward to hearing about the findings, recommendations of the thematic evaluation of IFAD support for smallholder farmers' adaptation to climate change. Thank you so much, Indran, and back to you.
Thank you very much, Joe, for the very comprehensive overview, most useful as backdrop. I now hand over to Donald Brown for his input, Associate Vice President, Program Management Department of IFAD. Donald?
Thanks very much, Indran, and great to be here at this learning event. And I, like Joe, would like to thank IOE for organising it and for this report. I think it's a really opportune moment because, as we see at the moment, much of our attention is focused on the impact of the Ukraine crisis on food systems, and obviously for IFAD's target group across different countries. I think it's essential not to lose sight of the fact that poor rural men and women do not see this crisis in isolation, but rather it's compounding other shocks and stresses, including the pandemic, but also climate change, as we see, for example, in the Horn of Africa at the moment. You know, the Horn of Africa is suffering an extreme drought and now moving on to probably a famine, on top of which the Ukraine crisis is happening. So it's kind of a strong reminder that, you know, despite these other things, whether it's the pandemic, whether it's Ukraine, the war in Ukraine, climate change is here and now to stay. I could quote other examples from Southern Africa, as we've seen recently with floods, cyclones, etc. And so this is why it's such an important topic. And I think you're all aware that IFAD was an early mover in this sort of side of things on climate adaptation, small-scale agriculture, through the Adaptation for Smallholder Agriculture Program, ASAP, which we launched in 2012 and has had some really, really good results, which is why we want to scale it up and deepen it through the ASAP Plus for IFAD 12 and beyond. So, you know, we've always had ambitions in the area of adaptation and climate mainstreaming. But I think it's, as the report brings out, it's fair to say that IFAD's capabilities still needs to grow in a number of areas. And I think the report brings out some specific recommendations in that. One area I would like to just focus a little bit on, and particularly from PMD's perspective, is it's really important that we better align our program of loans and grants, as we call it, the POLG, and our climate finance pipeline, so that we can really fully integrate both types of resources under the umbrella of transformative country programs. And working together with SKD, this is something we've been trying to do, is look at the two pipelines, take a much more strategic approach which sort of integrates the socioeconomic and climate resilience within the wider framework. And a good example of this is what we call the SD3C program in the Sahel, which is our kind of flagship regional program for the Sahel that really integrates a lot of GCF funded activities together with some of the socioeconomic and other work coming through the POLG in 6 countries. And before listening to a summary of the report, I wanted to close by acknowledging the progress and some of the positive experiences that we've actually found across the portfolio that maybe sometimes in IFAD, we're not very good at communicating and getting the visibility for it. And in that context, last week, I visited in Kenya with Sabrina Elba, the IFAD UN Special Ambassador, the Upper Tana Catchment Natural Resources Management Project. I'd heard a lot about this over the last couple of years. And I know when Jo visited, she was very complimentary about it. And I must say, I went slightly cynical that could this project be as wonderful as everyone talks about, but actually I came away really, really impressed. I mean, its aim is to promote sustainable management of water, forest and other natural resources, while at the same time promoting improved food security and incomes for low-income smallholders in the Upper Tana River Basin. For me, there was a couple of things that I took away. One was this doesn't happen overnight. So it's kind of a 10 years on of the project, a pilot phase. So we really learned by doing and integrated those lessons into the main one. Let me just give you a couple of the results from this one. So 42,000 households have adopted sustainable and climate resilient technologies, which has helped to bring over 2,000 hectares of land under climate resilient practices. But what was really, really interesting as well was not only was it improving the livelihoods and the incomes of those farmers by increasing access to irrigation, but it also had reduced water loss by adopting climate resilient practices, improving the efficiency of use of resources. So water loss and increased flow in the Upper Tana Basin had increased by 200%, and increased water quality by 150%. And that was so impressive that we actually, with a GEF grant, have set up a Upper Tana Water Fund, of which people like East African Breweries, Coca-Cola, Nairobi City Council have also invested in, so that we can continue to do this. And at the same time, part of it was rehabilitating nearly 3,000 hectares of forest land by using a sort of a plantation mechanism where smallholders with lack of access to land were able to plant trees, but use that land until the trees got to a size where it was no longer viable to have the agriculture in it. So I think it's just a really, really interesting example of a win-win, which sometimes, as I say, we need to remember and think about, and how do we scale that up? So maybe just to conclude, I think it's a great opportunity to reflect on the IOE report, to reconfirm our commitment, and to learn and be inspired by some of the examples of success that IFAD does have, and which other partners are investing in and replicating. So I look forward, like Jo, to a really good discussion. Thanks, Indra.
Thank you very much, Donald, also for the comprehensive overview, and to both of you. The purpose of learning events is to trigger a whole range of further discussions, because that's where we really want to make the utility element of the evaluation strong. At this stage, I'm going to ask Alexander Wojka, the head of our communications, to talk on the rules of engagement, some technical elements on how we're going to run, before I move over to Nanthi, who will do the summary presentation, and then we start with the discussions. Alexandra.
Thank you, Indran. Dear colleagues, good morning and good afternoon, according to where you may be connecting from. Allow me to join our IOE Director, Dr. Naidu, and our IFAD Associate Vice Presidents in welcoming you to this learning event. Now, I know that we are all very familiar with virtual Zoom events, but please allow me to quickly run through a few housekeeping matters. As you know, today's event will be structured into 2 main sessions. The first will feature a presentation by the lead author of the thematic evaluation, Dr. Nanthi Kisa, while the second will feature a panel discussion. At the end of each session, we will have a 30-minute Q&A segment. Now, to pose questions to either Dr. Nanthi Kisa during session 1 or to our distinguished panel members during session 2, I invite you to submit your entries by writing them directly into the Q&A box that you will find at the bottom of your screens. Prior to doing so, I would also invite you to please read quickly through the questions that other colleagues may have typed in before you. If you find that someone has already posted the same question that you wanted to ask, please do not re-enter the same question, but simply vote for that question. In fact, the Zoom interface will automatically bring to the top of the list those questions that receive the most votes, thus increasing the likelihood that they will be brought to the floor during the Q&A discussions. On a final note, I would also invite you to type your questions throughout each session, as opposed to waiting to the end of the presentation or the discussions, in order to ensure a smooth posting and voting process. And now, with that out of the way and without further ado, it is my pleasure to hand over the floor to Dr. Nancy Keeson. Nancy, the floor is all yours.
Thank you so much. Let me share the screen and try to see if that works. All right. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us in this learning event. And thank you for your time and years for this. Let me start the presentation by outlining the scope of this exercise. And the scope begins with IFAD declaring climate change as a priority in 2010. So we looked at all operations and country strategies starting from 2010. We counted 256 projects which had credible links to climate activities that are linked to climate risks. And 93 country strategies also were looked at. In addition, in order to look at these interventions of IFAD, we also looked at the corporate level actions to support these country level interventions. First, of course, we started with the replenishment commitments, starting from IFAD 8 and all the way to IFAD 12. We looked at the strategic frameworks. We looked at the climate strategy that was originally developed in 2010 and which has been updated in 2019 for the strategy and action plan on environment and climate change, 2019-2025. We also looked at a number of ongoing changes that have been happening since in the last 10 years, including, for instance, the programming approaches IFAD is pursuing to pursue climate responses, such as Rural Resilience Program. We also looked at the guidelines, such as social environmental climate change assessment procedures, started in 2015, updated in 2017, and later in 2020. We also looked at many tools that have been put in place, for instance, adaptation framework, database of adaptation solutions, and so on and so forth. We also looked at a number of related changes to policies, strategies, and guidelines, updates, knowledge management strategy, for instance, targeting guidelines, grants policies, guidelines to country strategies, project restructuring, and so on and so forth. So this covered a full scope of operations, interventions, as well as what was developed in support to advance these climate responses. We collected evidence through 5 different sources. The first one, of course, the most important one is the case studies that we conducted. We selected 20 countries to pursue case studies involving 35 projects, which is 14% of the IFAD climate portfolio. A stratified purposive sampling was adapted. We can discuss that in the question and answer session in detail. About half of these projects were ASAP projects, and 71 of the projects were ongoing. Remaining were completed projects. We also looked at 3 important learning themes along areas that will be important for strengthening climate responses: knowledge management, scaling up, and environmental sustainability of climate responses. We also combined the case studies with rapid evidence assessment, a method to collect secondary evidence from all available published literature. And the third part of the evidence was the electronic surveys we conducted, targeting the technical staff and managers working on climate area, as well as the IFAD project staff who are implementing project in the countries. We received 227 responses there. But we also looked at, we have conducted interviews at the headquarters with units based in Rome, as well as the executive board. And the units were relevant to the providing climate response. Altogether, we held about over 700 interviews in headquarters, as well as case studies, the 20 case studies. And all this evidence was supplemented by a document review, which analyzed past evaluations of IOE, the GIS data, as well as project, country, and corporate level documents assessing performance and related issues. Based on these analysis of evidence, we started deriving general findings. 3 stand out. First, our country strategies and operations are well aligned with national climate priorities, including the nationally determined contributions starting in 2015 after Paris Agreement. IFAD exceeded its target of investing 25% of its program of loans and grants on climate change adaptation. It exceeded it by 11%, and it ended up investing 36% of its portfolio on climate financed activities. Towards this end, it has mobilized over $500 million in climate change adaptation finance during the period 2010 to 2020. The evaluation also noted that there is an absence of a corporate level conceptual and results framework to measure the actual progress in strengthening climate resilience of smallholder farmers and families. We will come to this a bit later in session 2. A word about effectiveness. We looked at a very small sample, looking at the case studies conducted, as well as past IOE evaluations conducted on what we deemed as projects that dealt with climate response. It turns out that close to 80% of the projects were deemed moderately satisfactory or better in delivering climate results. So we do assess the climate commitments and development results of IFAD 11 were achieved or on track of being achieved. However, we have to caution that given the framework or the background, that our research framework do not really directly measure the climate resilience changes in smallholder families, but rather use proxy measures. This may not actually reflect the actual changes in smallholder resilience improvements. The second part that we want to highlight is the sustainability of climate change adaptation responses, which is how agricultural solutions interact with the ecosystem and what kind of consequences they have. IFAD committed under SACAP to do no harm in its climate responses. Failure to do no harm is likely to lead to low sustainability of benefits of IFAD interventions. It was noted that a strong subset of IFAD climate projects were performing at or beyond doing no harm. In 6 countries, we saw this happening. Successful projects pursued generally, if we want to generalize the nature of which projects became successfully addressing do no harm or better, they are integrated approach based on nature-based solutions happening at landscape levels. So we found that 5 additional cases were getting closer to do no harm, and 9 were aware that they ought to, the consequences to ecosystems, but their measures were not adequate to address do no harm. Conclusions, let me summarize the conclusions in 4 different areas. Since 2010, IFAD had made progress, significant process in making climate solutions as a corporate priority, and to achieve that, it has mainstreamed climate change adaptation in all its operations and concepts, recent ones. It has mobilized resources for climate solutions. and it committed to dedicate 40% of its program of loans and grants under IFAD 12 to climate finance. It is also paying increasing attention to addressing tensions arising from competition over use of land and water, particularly due to climate change issues. One of the key observations of conclusions that the evaluation draws is the insufficient capacity at all levels is a major bottleneck. This was observed also in the McKinsey report that was commissioned by IFAD. There is insufficient, as a result, there is insufficient technical support and adaptive management regarding climate solutions at the project level. There is little guidance to support win-win or do no harm climate solutions. There is insufficient investment in promoting government buy-in for climate solutions, as well as government capacities to implement climate solutions. The other aspect where we noticed the significant limitation was in the area of knowledge management and results-oriented learning at the organizational level. We saw project level knowledge exchanges frequently, but these were not escalated to national or regional levels or within IFAD in a sufficient way. The future of IFAD's ability to go beyond project level and successfully strengthen smallholder climate resilience at scale depends on its ability to secure additional funding and prioritize to promote results-focused non-lending activities, systematic activities with a clear target rather than ad hoc activities that begin late in the game, starting from the design throughout the implementation stage, a focus on non-lending activities. In terms of recommendations, we presented recommendations in the 6 areas. First, to concretely state, IFAD made a very good first start of developing a strategy and action plan on environment and climate change, 2019 to 2025. It will be useful to update the strategy to address the bottlenecks that the evaluation identified in strengthening climate change adaptation performance, as well as link those activities to necessary resources. So develop a results and resources framework to move forward. Second, the current guidance on IFAD 12 focuses on restorative solutions. We find that the current guidance is not quite adequate to this task. We find the need to develop climate adaptation solutions that simultaneously promote not only climate resilience, but environmental and economic resilience together will be ideal. And where that is not feasible, aiming at do no harm or better with the necessary offsets to compensate for the damage that is being done to the ecosystems. Third, it is, as noted earlier, it is necessary for IFAD to analyze the staff capacity and skill sets needed to design, implement, and track the ability to deliver climate finance of over 40% of POLG under IFAD 12. This is particularly important to consider the current decentralization and try to see the impact of the risks and benefits of the decentralization, how it is needed. So it's important to place right capacity at the right level at the right time in design and implementation to ensure successful climate responses, particularly when we have scaled up the climate finances from 25% to 40% of POLG. Fourth, systematically prioritize with dedicated resources, scaling up and non-lending activities. We underscore the word systematically. There are efforts to prioritize. There are efforts to dedicate resources in countries that we have seen, but it needs to be a corporate approach, starting from the design stage, how the scaling up will happen, how partnerships will be established, how knowledge management will happen throughout the implementation cycle. Related to that, the next recommendation was to develop and implement a framework and strategy for partnerships for results that are needed at the country level and beyond. Finally, it is important to have a sustained organizational learning from operational experience to improve current and future climate change adaptation performance. As Joe mentioned, there are many efforts that are going on, including assessment of what works and not. It is important to pool together all this information and have a systematic learning. We have enough ad hoc learning events that are taking place. We know that there are portals, platforms for knowledge solutions and so on, but it is important to tie all these activities to see the results focus, which being improved design quality and improved implementation support throughout the project cycle. The underlying message here is ad hoc events should be replaced by a systematic attempt at the country level, as well as regional level, as well as inter-regional level, to learn from our successes, which are many, but there should be a systematic way of tracking the successes, identifying the successes, and learn why these became successes. Thank you.
Just to point out, we now have, and I'm talking about attendees, that's excluding the panelists, over 70 online, and the questions will be coming in, but we do have now about 10 to 12 minutes for any questions that may be posed to Nanthi on this before we move on to the real meat and potatoes of the section, which is the panel discussion. I'll take questions now or comments. Okay, so Nanthi, I could share it over to you. There's some online, but before I get online, I've got Joe Puri first, and then there's a set of questions online. Over, Joe, to you.
Chair, I just thought that I would break the ice, and so please see it as a public good. I just thought, I thought, well, definitely a lot of the questions that are coming online are very interesting, and I'd like to see Nanthi's comments on it, but a couple of things as well, I think that might help to clarify. So, you know, in terms of the conceptual framework, one of the things that was very rightly pointed out by the evaluation, the key thing is that adaptation is almost it's a nascent, how should I say, field in terms of measurement, etc., across the world. But where IFAD has really made progress, and I'm hoping very much that many of you will also come to the learning event on impact assessments that we're going to host in early June, is the work that's gone into measuring as to how households that are targeted by IFAD investments are becoming more resilient. And here the key questions are really put into a survey. Of course, it's self-reported, all surveys are, but the important thing is that it is standardized across contexts. And so there is an ability to recover that is measured using econometric techniques that is then used across different contexts to understand as to how IFAD investments are helping that or not. And if you systematically just look at the impact assessment, so this is essentially saying what would have happened without IFAD investment and what is happening because, and this is a causal relationship because of the IFAD investments, what we find in the impact assessments is that there is a 14% statistically significant ability to recover as a consequence of IFAD investments on resilience. So again, to say that the point is well made, but a large part of our impact assessment work is actually pushing forward a lot of this work, and this is going to become very salient for COP27. And the second and the last point, apologies, Chair, is on the do no harm, right? I think an important caveat also looking at the sample that was there for the evaluation is also that almost all of the studies, I beg your pardon, all of the investments were designed before the updated CCAP was put together. So the updated CCAP only became effective last September, and the updated CCAP has specific provisions for climate as well as for biodiversity. And that's really important because now, according to the decision by the board as well, all of that has been incorporated into all of our designs, and we make a lot of effort. But it is true that even the updated CCAP needs to be seen as a positive force in design. And that's something that we're working, PMD, SKD work together to ensure that in designs. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joe. There's questions in the chat box, 5 open. Some may also be answered by members of the panel in the past. There's one which perhaps can be answered by either Joe or Donald. What are the criteria to classify projects as doing no harm?
A very good question. And this is a huge task. We do not underestimate the level of capacity, scope, and resources that will be needed for the management to do a full spectrum analysis. For instance, a full ecosystem analysis have to look at biodiversity. It'll have to look at land use and management. It'll have to look at water quality and management, and so on and so forth, soil health and so on. We did not attempt to cover all those things. We considered 2 parts, water quality and management mainly, and we also looked at land use and quality, implications to land use and quality. For instance, we would be looking at if a rangeland is being developed, where is it drawing the water from? Is the water source sustainable or not? So that is the kind of linkages, that level at which we were doing. It'll be a first order approximation. We do not have the time to do a full spectrum analysis in all 20 cases. What our effort was to show that there is a gap in this area, and IFAD could take steps to address it bit by bit, evolve its rigor and scope and scale in this area a bit more. This is, we found that, for instance, comparing to other organizations, IFAD is doing well, but at the same time we could do more is the feeling of the team, because they were very successful. 6 of the do no harm interventions that were identified were actually developed before SECAP. People were able to look at nature-based solutions by themselves and identify what are the development challenges and the way in which it's getting to the ecosystems and so on. So our call is to learn from what Donald was saying, learn from these successes to see how were they able to do this without the guidance, what allowed. So that is the kind of learning part is our effort, rather than specifying what exactly will be a mechanism to measure ecosystem effects. So our purpose is to act as a guide to focus attention on an area. So I'll stop there. Yeah.
Thanks, Nanti. Some of the questions in the chat box are actually aimed at IFAD. So if I could ask, and it's stimulated, it's fine that it's coming up here. There's the question by Philippe, the last one in the bottom, relating to knowledge and cross-fertilization, the role of national government that is also coming in, and put so on the need to measure resilience. Could I ask this to Joe and Donald to respond to those questions, IFAD questions?
Sure. Donald, I'll go first and hand it over. Okay, so the question is considered too thin in staffing. Interesting to hear that IFAD is considered too thin in staffing and follow-up in country and project level, and also the knowledge sharing and cross-fertilization not happening at satisfactory levels. What can we do with current constraints, and what are low-hanging fruits? Really good question, Philip, and thanks. So the first one is, it is true, we are stretched in terms of staffing and at the country and project level, but really important to consider that, you know, IFAD is an IFI. Most of our investments on the ground are lending operations, right? So traditionally, and we were talking about this earlier today, traditionally, anything that is knowledge related is non-lending. Or supposed to be non-lending, but although we do want to make it a part of lending operations, but our non-lending budget at IFAD is extremely meager. So we're really dependent on largesse or in-kind contributions. at the PMU level, as well as within our own staff, to see as to what kind of knowledge work that we do. And that's something that I do want to raise the profile of. And as I took over as AVP of the Strategy and Knowledge Department, one of the key things that I do want to do is to try and see as to how we can change that, what we can do to look at low-hanging fruits, but also to make it an attractive option for countries to both borrow and borrow for. Because once we make it an attractive offer, then we can make this a very critical part of our loan operations as well. But that means it has to then really align itself very strongly with the overall impact narrative that we are making within country, right? So knowledge helps to support advice on policy, helps to support greater impact. And that's the transformation that we want to see within IFAD and operations. But it is true that our non-lending operation budget is very, very small. And so we've got to make choices there. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Joe. I see Donald is typing a response over there, but maybe he can come in.
Yeah, thanks, Indran. Yeah, I was going to type, but I will cancel it. Easier to do it that way. Just coming back to Philippe's issue. One, as Joe says, resources are very tight on the non-lending. One area that we're not making enough use of is the supplementary fund fees on the staffing side of things. It's something which I'm looking into from a PMD perspective. We need to have one corporate system that has all the information about the supplementary funds, about the management fees that we get in, and also the fees for design, supervision, etc., that we can all access and make sure that we know what's available and we plan and use these early on. Very often it's unclear what's available, and when we get the resources, they come too late in a year to be able to plan and use them at the beginning of the year. And I think it would make a big difference if we had much more clarity on these, and then we programmed and planned them earlier and better. I think is one easy win on that side. Thanks.
Thank you, Donald. In terms of the evaluation related questions, Nanthi, any on the role of national government we did look at in terms of some of the engagement.
Yeah.
Some comment on that from Zhang.
It is also, that question is also tied to the question that Donald answered now. We notice that different scale or levels of IFAD efforts are needed to advance non-lending activities. In some countries, the government is in the driver's seat. They want climate action, and the partnerships are therefore naturally configured into national policies. In some countries, we have seen where there is a symbiotic relationship almost, where interventions of IFAD are automatically coupled with the decision-making processes where non-lending activities become easy. I don't want to name names at this stage, but even the recent missions that I undertook on a different evaluation, I noticed with one staff member, they were able to, with the long-standing country program officer, they were able to achieve the kind of linkages which were remarkable. So that is an ideal situation where a country is leading on the climate change and they know what they want, and IFAD supports fully that effort. The more challenging task for IFAD will be in situations where IFAD has to advocate for the importance of climate responses and investment in climate responses. There, as Donald pointed out, we may need more resources in order to systematically pursue this. So the partnerships that Zhang is asking, calling out for, it has to be judged based on the country context, and that will tie to also the resources needed to pursue non-lending activities. And this is what we are seeing so far. Over.
Thank you, Nanthi. I think, Joe, you answering a question on the national government, but I think after that, if Nanthi, if you could come in terms of IOA reporting and how we measure resilience, because there's a comment that perhaps we are not doing it in the most optimal way. If you could prepare that. And also the question from Paulo, in terms of the KM communication, partnership building and policy engagement at country and regional levels. It's an IFAD question in a way. Donald or Joe, if any of you have answered this question.
Sorry, Indran, can you just say the last part again?
Yes, so this is the question from Paolo Silveri, that there's many positive and successful operations and results, but how do you convince the M&E-KM communication nexus and how that works? Much of the potential value added lies in the institutional capacity to scale up, and it can be expanded through KM-COM with partnership building and policy engagement. That falls in your section, Joe.
Yeah, sure. And again, I think again, it's one of the reasons that we are espousing decentralization in a very strong way. I mean, policy and knowledge work requires, consistent, persistent, patient partnership and relationship building. One of the key learnings that we've had from evidence in what works in advocacy is that people have to trust you, but trust is not built if you just fly in and fly out, right? And so underlying all of this is the entire work on decentralization that both Donald and I are executive champions of, to really ensure that we are standing with our national counterparts hand to hand, and we're working with them to understand what their needs are and how we can support it in a responsive and agile way. So I can't stress this enough. And again, this is very intangible. There's going to be no sort of, you'll come back and the evaluation, and having been on the evaluation side, there will be an evaluation that sort of says, well, all of this is anecdotal. The fact is that the consequences of good advocacy and the consequences of good knowledge work will only display themselves in a few circumstances, but they come after years and years of relationship building and trust building. But they are really a sine qua non for an institution like IFAD, because our investment amounts in countries will always, well, at least for the anticipated future, will stay small. How we can amplify our impact is through policy work. And that has to come from not just building the relationship, but also then doing it credibly. And that's why, and climate, especially, the field is moving super fast. So we've got to be really edgy and state of the art in terms of our knowledge and how we can advise countries on figuring out pathways for transformation in reaching their nationally determined contributions, so NDCs, as well as their NAPAs, right? National Adaptation Plans of Action. So that's my long answer to an even longer work plan that, of course, we need to plan within management. Thanks.
Indran, if I may suggest, we've got some very good people that are doing this every day on the ground, on the panel, like Sarah Mbago, Oliver Sen, Pate and Omar. Maybe we should bring them a little bit into this conversation, because they're the people that grapple with this on a daily basis. Over.
The session 2 actually answers or addresses part of this, not fully, but part of this in the form of the question, actually, particularly targeting not knowledge management, but partnerships as well. Over.
Yes, no, thank you, Donald. So they would be able to actually participate in session 2, but they have the questions, they've heard it, and I think that'll be important. We're running on time, and with that, thank you very much to the panel and for the questions, which is extremely rich and insightful. We now move on to what we call the firing line. And this is the panel discussion that I will moderate. And we have presenters. 2 are here and 1 is not here because of a crisis. And that's Andy Rowe. He's not available in Canada, but we will get through to that. But we are extremely delighted to have a team of panelists, Sarah Bungu, the Regional Director, East and Southern Africa Division, Resha Omar, Rasha Omar, the Country Director for Sudan and Djibouti, Near East, North Africa and Europe Division. Also welcome Amat Pate, Regional Climate and Environmental Specialist, West and Central Africa, and Olivia Page, Regional Climate and Environmental Specialist, Latin America and the Caribbean Division. As you would see to the participants, and online, that we have an extremely well experienced and rich group here. My first framing question is in terms of the conceptualization of climate resilience in projects, and I'm going to pose this question to Amat and then Olivier. In the first CLP meeting of the evaluation in April 2021, IOE presented as an emerging finding that a corporate level conceptual framework for climate resilience was missing. Following this meeting, the ECG convened a working group comprising of different IFAD units, including PMD, and recruited a consultant to review existing literature to address this gap. This is indeed a step in the right direction. Could you comment on the progress so far, and in the meantime, how newer designs are addressing this issue? So over to the two. I would invite Amat and then Olivier to answer this question.
Thank you very much, Chair. Thanks also for this very interesting report. And I think it's also a learning document which help also the institution to improve and increase its resilience to climate change by also supporting the resilience of smallholder farmers. Those are the communities we serve on a daily basis, and they're the most vulnerable. So from a climate change perspective, our main target smallholder farmers work on rain-fed agriculture in all regions. And that rain-fed agriculture is, on less than 2 hectares, it's 2 to 3 months, and sometimes less in some region. And if you look at the climate change from an impact perspective, it is a risk multiplier from a vulnerability perspective, but also the natural capital, because the natural capital is land, it's the water, the ecosystem they use to produce the food and also feed the urban population we are. So the vulnerability from a food security perspective, but also water stress, health, energy, when you have less water, obviously, if you want to have also hydropower, those impact and combined with the soil degradation, erosion, obviously you have, migration, conflict, and stability. So we look at it from that climate change impact, but also non-climate change stressors. So it's look at the political instability, land tenure, food markets, inadequate infrastructure, because we work also on climate resilient roads, urbanization, and pollution. So combine most of these elements impact, and they are risk for our investment. So now the conceptual framework from what was done since 2010 up to now has evolved using ASAP Plus and all the other programs. So we evolve, we grow like a baby, and then you became a little child, and now we are growing and trying to move fast and running in this area of the climate agenda. So now when we look at the different barriers from a design perspective and agreeing with some of the gaps that we have from an institutional perspective, ECG has evolved from a climate and environment to social inclusion, because those aspects are very important. They have been integrated with over the last 4 years, the mainstreaming aspect, but now from a design perspective, the conceptualization on how we design programs and how we blend it into our operation. So we look at it now from a climate rational. What we do is from a conceptual point of view, we don't, if you want to design a robust programs, so a climate rational, we look at frequency of and intensity duration of climate change. So whether it's drought, floods, landslide, water stress, so the data and evidence is key. And these sometimes are missing in many regions. It could be, either they don't have it, or it's somewhere you can't find it, or you have to produce it. And most of the 2 parameters we are looking at when we look at the climate rational to strengthen our design and where gaps can be and can improve, it's the temperature, because we have to look at the historical temperature, how it has been observed in the past over the past 100 years using some specific models, either it's Cordex or RCP 4.5, 8.5 for the projection. So the historical, but also the projected. And the projected, when we talk about climate change and adaptation, particularly, we are not talking about a gain of tomorrow. We're talking about medium and long term. And that long term is like an horizon of 20 years, 30 years, and so on. And this is why we came up with all those models. And the impact we are looking is today, if we have historical trend in the past, and it has hit the production system yield in terms of production, and then you lose 10% of, maize, rice, cocoa, anything that is related to value chain, what's gonna be that situation in 20 years, 30, 40 years, if the trend is still the same, and if we have a change in terms of temperature, but also in terms of rainfall. And that is extremely important because rainfall as well, it can be a lot or nothing, or the frequency is very high, or humidity, and it creates also disease. And that change, and you have a shift on the biomes and everything, and conceptualizing it is looking at it now from a technical point of view. We use SECAP. The SECAP is, the tool has been like the entry point where all those elements is, they are assessed, the climate risk categorized, high, medium, and low. And from the intensity or the categorization, we try to come up with specific intervention. And those intervention, what is very interesting in all our design is today when you're given a value chain development project, whether it is livestock, cattle, chicken, or whether it is, agroforestry, you're looking at cocoa value chain and the others. So what are right now business as usual, and what do you propose with the adaptation? And that's where now the innovation should come. You can have nice adaptation activities, but in the conceptual thinking, you need also to get like, the procurement. Do you have it? If you propose a certain seeds, climate resilient, do you have it in that country? Do you have it in the region? So if you propose a certain technology, can you procure it? So the green procurement integrated in the conceptual thinking, the design process is also part of this kind of passion, being patient, but also trying to contextualize whatever you are doing as opposed to business as usual, which is conventional agriculture. And when there is any shock, so you can't recover. So here the resilience for climate change is really looking at when you have a shock, how now the system can withstand and recover and continue to produce and even better. And the adaptation is really the benefit you will have from 1 ton per hectare if you are talking about sorghum or rice, because you have used a rotational system or you are using, agroforestry system, and you can reach 4 ton per hectare in that very stressful condition. And we have this design and adaptation framework in the ECG. We have a certain number of activities we've learned from different value chain, whether it's input, production, processing, market, road infrastructure, warehouses, and which we integrate systematically in. It has a cost. That incremental cost is what we integrate in the result and resource framework. In that result and resource framework, that has an extra cost. And most of the time, that extra cost, what we are bringing in from the supplementary fund is we go on other funds like the GCF, the JEF, the adaptation fund, to bring the additional money on top of the IFAD investment. And I think this new way of doing business and blending it to the different approach, like Donald said, for the SG3C, where we go one outside and get additional funds to build the resilience of the portfolio to climate shocks, is the way to go, because that's also what the partners like. We have an investment, that's our comparative advantage to other international institutions that don't have baseline investment. And then you bring that money, blend it in, and bring that new innovation and try to add. It helps also IFAD from its target, corporate target of climate focus 25% on the IFAD 11, now moving to 40%, to get these innovative activities and different indicators in the result and resource framework, the mean of verification, the assumption, which those different funds will track your result framework when you go and try to submit a proposal. So this is how we are doing it, and we're doing it from its first activities with investment criteria, which will help really to first, the do not harm is there, but sustainable and profitable business. And right now, adaptation, we are looking at it not only like something which is just do not harm, but it's from a economic and all the effort we are doing, economic and financial analysis, which you integrate into the FR, but also into the result framework. They help also to show the economic and financial value addition on the adaptive activities proposed in the proposal, the cost and that extra cost, which tomorrow, not today, you may not have the harvest, the benefit, but in 5, 10, 15 years, and the measurement of the benefit need to be on a longer term horizon. The lifespan should be always 20 years to build the resilience of the small scale farmers. So these are my perspective and from experience of our work in the region, but I can come back also to provide more additional information. Over.
Thank you very much, Oliver. Very, Amat, very comprehensive response, and clearly you've illustrated in very practical terms what gets done. I'll move over to Oliver to get his perspective, and thereafter we'll get the two of you to reflect on some of the questions that are coming in the box. Oliver.
Okay. Thank you very much for inviting me to be a part of this panel. Yes. The first thing I'd like to point out is how surprisingly difficult it is to have a conceptual framework towards adaptation to climate change, because one would like to think that this is a technical solution, that you can do a diagnosis of what will possibly happen with climate change, identify potential solutions and options, and then design a project that implements the best solutions that we've analyzed. And the reality, as I've learned both in project design and particularly in project implementation, is that's not really the case, because adaptation solutions, the climate change problem is extremely context specific. The same problem or the same diagnosis can have very different impacts on people depending on what they're doing, depending on where they live, depending on their socioeconomic status, depending on their social structures. So adaptation responses have to be, by definition, very context specific. And in that sense, it's very difficult to have a one-size-fits-all approach. So that's, I think, where we've been working very hard on, at least in the Latin America region, is how to match a kind of technical overall diagnosis of climate change with integrating locally specific and people-specific responses to climate change. And I think that's where I would say we're at this point, is trying to find that merger between having people understand what climate change means to them and participate in designing, defining, and implementing a solution, which often involves behavioral change. So it really does mean that people will have to change the way they do things many times. And in order for them to do that, the most important thing is that they're convinced. While infrastructure and technology, I think, are important variables, and obviously we do need to come in with technical innovation, it's the behavioral change aspect, I think, is extremely important, equally important, if not more. The other issue, of course, is that climate change is also about managing uncertainty, right? We would like to say, we can tell you this is the diagnosis, this is what the future is going to look like. The reality is that we don't know what the future is going to look like. And many times the diagnosis that we get is that, there will be more drought, but there will be more intense rainfall is a classic, right? Well, what does that mean? How do you respond to that? And human beings, by definition, do not like uncertainty. And designing projects and implementing projects to manage uncertainty is quite complex and difficult. A third aspect I'd like to point out is that, because of the need for engagement by local beneficiaries, because of the need for people to understand, develop their own solutions, and be truly engaged in implementing them, This requires a strong technical capacity within the project teams in order to work with communities in finalizing that diagnosis, tailoring it to their specific conditions, bringing in indigenous people's knowledge, for example, that's always very important if available, integrating our mainstream themes of gender approach and so forth. These are issues that require high technical capacity. And I found it quite difficult to set up project teams that really do have these capacities and really can bring this to the table. And if I'm working in Latin America, which is a relatively, more advanced, if you want to call it, in terms of technical capacity region than other regions that IFAD works in, I can imagine that this is a problem that we face across the board. So, based on that, I really do believe that a corporate approach is highly necessary. I've been very happy to engage in the discussions that we've had so far, in which we kind of are discussing and identifying what different approaches we have been taking and how all of these can add up to and contribute to a common corporate approach. I do warn that we have to be realistic in terms of what can be achieved, both in terms of not overburdening the complexity of our designs, overburdening project management teams, and be sure that we can provide the appropriate technical support in order for these this framework to be implementable. Because we really do work within constrained environments. The challenges of the field are quite immense, and we cannot expect project teams to be able to manage and address all these technical difficulties in the field. And I think finally, and I'll stop here, we also have to be realistic, and I think this is important. What do we really want to achieve? What do we really mean by increasing resilience? And define it at the project specific level. We're not going to solve all climate change problems with a $20–30 million project. If it were that easy, then climate change would not be the problem that it is right now. So I think one of the important points is to manage expectations, perhaps be more realistic about what we really mean by increasing resilience, or what we can really contribute to with a project, and make sure we do that well, rather than trying to say we're solving the entire problem with a single intervention. Thank you. Over.
Thank you very much. We've had two very comprehensive answers, also pointing out the reality of working and the constraints that they are there. Before moving on from this section, and Amat and Oliver, we will also get this all recorded and follow-up discussion. I think it's important as we do the proceedings for this event. There is an important question in the box which needs answering, and that relates to vulnerability assessment, especially for the agricultural sector, and which methodologies does IFAD support or use? If I could have a response to that before closing the session and moving on to the next, because it is a critical area from any one of you three. Amat or Joe?
Yeah, no, thanks.
Okay.
No, thanks for the vulnerability assessment. So we produce SECAP. So the SECAP is our document which also inform the project design. And it's not like systematic we do it in all countries, but I think it's also a good practice we have to. Now, from when we are well prepared and the resources are there and we have good example, I can give the example of Chad, which is extremely vulnerable to climate change. And we had in the past a partnership with CIRAD, which is a research center. So they produce a comprehensive vulnerability assessment in the country. And that document was, and by researchers who knows very well, livestock production, nomadism, and also agri production in the country. That document was used to prepare the SECAP. And during that board, the SECAP was well appreciated. It was one of the most apparently comprehensive SECAP they have seen from one of the board members. So such document goes deeper to look at the social issues, the vulnerability to climate shocks, but also to the natural resource degradation, but other political and non-climate stressors. And compile, we can integrate it into the SECAP from a social, economic, and environment climate perspective, and that informed the project design, the context analysis, as well as all intervention which we will be proposing as part of the resilience building. Here, again, when we talk about resilience, the shock, and how do you recover to maintain still the production. If you are producing 1 ton per hectare and you always have this drought and change of terms of rainfall patterns, and you are not able now to produce 1 ton per hectare, then there is a problem, food insecurity with them. But if you are adapting and there is still that issue of climate shocks, whether it is drought or rainfall, but you are still producing 1 ton per hectare, or you go to 2 ton per hectare because the adaptation practice or technology which has been proposed help to use less water and you are able to do, then you are resilient to that shock. So you are still maintaining your productive capacity in a very stressful condition. And most of the technology we have in the Sahel, including the Zai, natural regeneration techniques, half moon techniques, those ones are extremely useful in such condition, and these are indigenous technologies. So those are compiled in those vulnerability assessment, and we use it to inform most of our design as well as also the cost of over.
Thank you very much. Ahmad, any additions, Joe, from your end on the tools, methodologies?
No, I'm sorry that I didn't see the question, but thanks very much. And I think it was
vulnerability assessments.
Yeah, but on the vulnerability assessment, but Pate answered it really well. And we, I mean, we also, other than the vulnerability assessments, we also do a lot of other, ex ante measurements as well. How much are we sequestering? What are we, and we use exact tools. So we use a lot of tools to do ex ante measurements as part of our CCAP work, all of which then goes into what's called the CCAP document, and then helps to inform the design as well. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Thank you on this item. I'll now move to the next big question, and we would have important inputs coming in from Sarah and Rasha and Oliver in the end. Climate solutions, doing no harm or better. The evaluation identified 6 IFAD projects that involve climate solutions that were doing no harm or better. 5 of these were designed prior to the introduction of CCAP in 2015. Could the panelists, could you comment on the factors that contributed to the success? What have IFAD done to capture and replicate these successes? And secondly, what lessons were learned from these successes by PMD and ECG that have demonstrably improved new designs? I have pleasure in calling upon Sarah first in terms of to make an input, and thereafter followed by Rasha, and then we'll come back to the head courses. Sarah.
Thank you, Indran, for inviting me to join this conversation, and all the colleagues, prior speakers, Joe and Donald. It's my pleasure to share some perspectives from East and Southern Africa Division in IFAD. I will confine my response to 2 concrete examples of prior and post the entry of the CCAP framework for IFAD. The first one, I take and borrow from Ethiopia, the community-based infrastructure and natural resource management program, which was financed between 2009 and it had an extension to 2018. And that distinction is very important. Now, there was a couple of assumptions and objectives that this particular operation wanted to achieve. And one of the fundamental departure points was that land degradation was actually driving low productivity and resulting in food insecurity and poverty around the Lake Tana watershed. And so this was a fundamental point of departure, and this operation, together with the government of Ethiopia, thought to reverse those gains. And 3 pathways were selected around trying to achieve this. I remember we were not at that time in 2009, really talking of biodiversity loss, I think globally, regionally, within and outside IFAD. And so essentially, the first pathway was to look at how we could actually restore and build the climate resilience of the actual watershed itself and reverse land degradation by improving soil fertility. So that was the first climate solution that was offered. The second pathway was really participatory watershed management. So there the issues, or at least the assumptions were, if we invest in planning, around the watershed. And if we crowd in investment in 3 areas, infrastructure, on improved productivity on farm, and tree planting in a bid to restore, maybe we will also get the returns around reduced land degradation, deforestation, overgrazing, and overexploitation of the wetlands. And the third pathway in this particular example was also to look at the social inclusion approach, of which is really fundamental to the way that IFAD works in communities. And there the underlying assumption was, if we can secure land tenure, we would have 2 wins. One in reducing conflict and trade-offs around resources, and also incentivizing smallholder farmers to invest in their parcels of land in order to invest in basically sustainable production. So that was really the construct. So many, an ambitious operation wanting to achieve many things, also piloting things. And we were partnering with Jeff on this as well, on the onset. And it was very interesting that we didn't do 3 things that we have learned from today's important session. And just listening to all of you has really, it really struck me with this case. The first thing was there wasn't really an integrated landscape approach that the project utilized. It looked at the catchment and thought piecemeal or in phases we can do something. And so that sort of holistic approach and landscape was not there. And then in the blending, because the IFAD financing started early, of course, government financing was also there, huge contribution by beneficiaries, by the way, 5 million, which was very important. The Jeff financing came later in the program, and the blending process didn't happen so well or so smoothly. And then we didn't, and I see the question that came back just now, there wasn't a concrete poverty mapping and vulnerability assessment that was done in order to maximize returns. So what did we see that came back? Well, I mean, there were some fantastic results from this operation. And namely that, you know, we did get the infrastructure and construction for soil water conservation, mainly on off-farm areas. So there was that terracing, the traditional sort of stuff. And we did do some tree planting, insufficient to reverse degradation, but that did take place in terms of pathway 2. But there was less on-farm investments for conservation. Pathway 3, in terms of social inclusion, mainstreaming, natural resource management for improved livelihoods, there we did introduce land certificates, which did, in terms of the local level, create ways and means in which the conflict was reduced. And that was very useful in demarcating of land. So that was good. Unfortunately, there was an overemphasis on that and less investment crowded in improving productivity, so improving soil conservation, management of water, and less on forage production and farm inputs and that mix. So productivity gains were not as high and livelihoods were not as improved, but at least institutional framework for land security was secured. And in terms of the actual climate resilience of the watersheds, 2 different models were used. So in one of the models, soil fertility was enhanced and land degradation reduced, but in some of the other ones that wasn't. So this is just to showcase you that, you know, this is an earlier generation operation. In ESSA, in Ethiopia, one of the flagships, the earlier models, trying to understand climate. And I did feel we learned, because fast forward, you know, the new operation 2015 to 2023, what did we get? We have the Eswatini smallholder market-led project in Eswatini. And I'm happy to say in 2020 and 2021, this project won the prestigious Eswatini Biodiversity Award. And why did it win this? And in fact, the objectives of this particular operation was to support the participation of planning of 25 chiefdoms in the Lower Veld, you know, include and touch 16,000 food insecure and deficient households, improve the soil and water management for market-led smallholder agriculture development, and support supply chains in livestock. So when we see that landscape approach immediately adopted in the Eswatini case has yielded a completely different level of result. And the fact that government commitment on this operation was equal to the Jeff roughly financing, also equal to IFAD financing, the blending happen straight off in the beginning, and there's a framework for recognizing biodiversity in the country of Eswatini and rewarding that. And the multiple returns that have happened in conserving wetlands, protecting them, the hectares of land which have been restored in terms of flora and fauna species, owls, birds, and insects, the introduction of community laws, the fact there's accountability systems at household level. 481 farmers, many of whom are women, have already adopted and they're certified for permaculture home gardens. And then the fact that ICRAF, together with IFAD, together with Jeff, has managed to introduce, led by and under the leadership of the government of Eswatini, a national level surveillance of soil and rangeland health. All of these things have been the ultimate result of this project. So I think there we can see the lessons of learning from earlier on in the Ethiopia case of adopting a landscape approach, blending the finance, having equal commitment of all the stakeholders there, and then limiting the complexity of the program, building up planning and accountability systems at the local level, and introducing a couple of key protection tools, investment in protection and restoration, as well as in technical and capacity building, as well as establishing a framework in which this can be done, and measurement, data, introducing digital, and making things explicit and clear. So I would like to stop here in describing that experience, those two different experiences. And I think as we go forward, we're going to definitely learn, not only from the Ethiopia case, which was excellent. I think Donald classically gave an intermediary result in Kenya, and now we see in Eswatini, and I do believe the next generation and hope those connected here of IFAD programs will build on all these experiences. Back to you, Indran.
Thank you very much, Sarah, for the very comprehensive illustration, which demonstrates what happens in the real world and how the learning has been taken off. I now have pleasure in calling upon Rasha Omar, the same question for illustrations from your end. Thank you. Rasha.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Indran, and thank you very much also for the invitation to join this panel today. So I will speak more from the experience of the Sudan program because one of the projects were highlighted among the 6 successful projects that were identified as do no harm or better. And this is the livestock marketing and resilience program. And I'd like to acknowledge here the efforts of my colleagues, Hani and Antonio, in the design of this program, and my colleague, Tariq Ahmed and Ahmed Subahi in the supervision of this program. Now, the IOE, the evaluation itself on climate change adaptation, had highlighted 2 aspects or 2 interventions that were particularly useful in this program. The first one was the formulation of the climate resilience community village plans. And the second one was the development and co-management of the stock routes, which are really the migratory routes of the livestock between the rainy season and dry season grazing areas. Now, what I wanted to say about the success of these 2 interventions is that first, they were built on about 10 years of experience in implementing such interventions. So the knowledge base was there, the approach, techniques of engaging with the communities were also there. And very importantly, there was also government capacity to implement these interventions, whether this was at the level of the locality, extension teams to be able to engage with the communities, or at the level of the range and pasture department in terms of organizing the stock route demarcation, as well as conflict resolution around natural resources conflicts that may arise during the movement of the livestock herders. The other aspect that was also very much enabling the success of the implementation of these 2 interventions was the fact that there was a law had been put in place, which was related to the range and pasture legislation, which allowed the demarcation of the rangelands for management by the communities, and which also allows the demarcation of the stock routes. So there was, if you want, an enabling environment which facilitated the implementation of these activities. So what the Livestock Marketing and Resilience Program did then was to use this knowledge base, and what they have added was more of a commercial approach, especially to the management of the livestock herd, as well as creating economic activities along the livestock routes, whether this is related to animal collection centers, dairy enterprises, and so forth. Now, how are we capturing this experience so that it's available to a wider, let's say, development practitioner, as well as harmonized and spread across the various states in Sudan? The first one is that the project itself has already documented these interventions, and has also used the learning from these interventions to develop to update the natural resource strategy and incorporate in it climate change adaptation elements. The other aspect that we are also working on is the range and pasture legislation. So incorporating within the range and pasture policy now, the learnings from the experiences from the Livestock Marketing and Resilience Program, and indeed the knowledge of 10 years. We also are working on a how-to-do note. And interestingly enough, it was done with the Brazil multi-country office, because they also have similar experiences, especially in terms of incorporating climate vulnerability and climate analysis at the level of community planning, and also adopting a landscape approach. So a very similar approach was developed in Brazil, and it's the subject of the how to do note, which would be published soon. Now, how are we taking this forward in new designs? So actually, the new designs are introducing a number of new elements based on the learnings from the past experience. The work that we have been doing so far in terms of natural resource management and climate change adaptation, and reducing also conflict over natural resources, have been very much led by the public sector and by public financing. So what we're trying to do in the new program, similar to, for example, the Sustainable Natural Resources and Livelihoods Program in Sudan, is to try now to pilot a mix of public plus private financing. And experiences like the Upper Tana River Basin project would also be very useful in terms of the funds that are established to be able to manage natural resources at the watershed level. So that is one of the things we're looking at now. So bringing in more of the private financing, private meaning more from the savings and loan financing from the communities, but that also does not preclude corporate social responsibility and even private sector investments. The second aspect that we're trying to introduce in this in the approach for the new designs is to incorporate much more climate information services, because we've realized that there is a need of anticipating potential shocks and building contingency plans accordingly, and also being able to more proactively manage the dry spells that may be appearing, both managing them on the crops plus the livestock as well. What is interesting is in terms of monitoring, we were discussing different indicators for resilience. So the new design is incorporating the resilience scorecard, and we'll be seeing how it goes, at the level of the baseline surveys and then subsequently. And finally, I also thought it was interesting to hear it from the Eswatini example, but also we're introducing the monitoring of rangeland and soil health as part of the new designs, because we we've realized that it's also important to have this evidence to facilitate further investments from the communities in the preservation of their natural resources and building their resilience. Over, and thank you.
Thank you very much. Also an extremely comprehensive input. I think this event is really very illustrative for all of us to realize what it is on the ground as we move in terms of real examples. I'll ask Oliver to make a brief input and then come back for some closing sections. Oliver, are you available?
Yes, I'm here.
Just a short input, and then we will got the last section where you'll come in again. Thank you.
A lot has been said. So what I'd like to point out is that if you look at these projects that have been classified as do no harm or better, they're all based on nature-based solutions, essentially. They all work with the ecosystem and the environment in which our farmers live and earn their livelihoods, and try to identify the ecosystem services that these areas provide, and work hand in hand to enhance these ecosystem services for agricultural production. So I think the standpoint that we're taking is that agriculture, by definition, is an intervention in a natural system. It's a management of a natural system. It's a use of a natural system for food production. So to what extent can we make that intervention the least harmful possible, or in this case, an improvement of the ecosystem? And that's really hard to achieve. And I think that's been part of the kind of controversy that we had over this definition of do no harm or better, because agriculture, to a certain extent, by default, will cause a certain amount of harm, or is likely to cause a certain amount of harm. So I think we do have to maintain that in perspective. I think we have good examples of working with the ecosystem for agricultural production. I'm quite proud of the Brazil project we presented to the GCF in the way that it transforms the perspective of northeastern Brazil from an arid ecosystem that needs a lot of additional irrigation and a lot of additional water to be brought in, to actually interpreting it as a system that is capable of producing its own water resources. And I think that's a good example of how we can use this this approach of nature-based solutions, but it's still really hard. It's hard to convince governments. It takes a lot of work. It's hard for governments to use loan money for adaptation. It's a long-term process with several risks. Transforming these type of productive processes is not easy. And I refer to my previous intervention in terms of also requiring behavioral change and buy-in from local actors. So I think there's a lot to be learned from these 6 case studies. We are incorporating it into future designs, but I also, would like to throw in a word of caution, is that it's very difficult in the context we work in. It's not only a technical solution, it's a political decision as well. And we can't realistically aspire for all of IFAD's interventions to have this ecosystem-based approach. So I really value these examples as shining stars, and I do hope we can move more of our portfolio in that direction. But we also have to be realistic about what we can achieve. Thank you. Over.
Thank you very much for the 3 excellent inputs. I'm going to hand over to Nanti now on the last broad question: climate solutions, scaling up, and knowledge management. And we will then get the inputs before we do wrap up. This has really been rich examples that have come in. We're also going to get it transcribed, because this is actually quite often lost. It comes naturally and spontaneous in the event. Over to you, Nanti. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much indeed. And let me move to the last question here. We focused on the environmental sustainability part in the last question. Now here we are going to take a broader look at climate solutions Particularly, we are trying to look at the organizational efforts to map climate change adaptation responses that were scaled up and knowledge managed. So what lessons were learned and what were the results? So basically, we are asking the lessons that we have learned as an organization from the rich experience we have had in climate responses of solutions that were scaled up and solutions where knowledge management was handled well, going beyond the project level and going into IFAD as well as national and above. Over to you. And first, may I invite Sarah and Rasha as well as Pate to respond in that order. Over to you, Sarah.
Thank you very much, Nanti, and I will endeavor to be brief. I want to start by thanking the ESSA climate team, of course, for trying to always document the knowledge lessons that we're trying to gather and all the experiences we're trying to map so that we can learn from what we're doing in terms of climate. And this team is led by Paxina. So from the ASAP perspective, ASAP has been very successful in Mozambique under the Pursue program to take to scale improved cassava varieties and which are drought tolerant, and the use of multi-purpose boreholes, which are solar driven for forage conservation technologies. So ASAP was very helpful in documenting these two individual technologies and taking them from 3 provinces under the Mozambique Pursue program to 10 provinces under the PROCAVA program. So this is one very concrete result of how we are trying to use knowledge, use the vehicles that we have to document and scale up. The second experience was in Rwanda, which involved improved access to climate information services. I think also Russia talked about this, using participatory integrated climate service of agriculture called PIXA approach. Basically, there was climate risk, basically mapping, and then mitigation and management plans for adaptation were also developed. This was done in partnership with the Rwanda Meteorology Agency, and there was different types of messages, including early warning phone messages on a daily, weekly, monthly basis, and also seasonal forecasts were shared to small-scale farmers. And this really helped because it really helped cooperative members, especially in the events of storms, heavy rainfall, and forecast flooding and strong winds. They were able to avoid either planting at the wrong time, avoid harvesting at the wrong period. And this really had demonstrated effects on the post-harvest losses and actual quantities of crops harvested. So that was also very interesting as a knowledge initiative. Again, it was also financed under the ASAP program that was mentioned earlier by Joe and Donald. And finally, there was a toolkit for responsible financing for smallholder agriculture, the RIFSA. And this was targeting rural finance service providers to support them in integrating climate risk analysis in their portfolios and the advisory services they're providing. Really important for the ESSA portfolio because we have a huge program on financial inclusion projects across 8 countries working with public agricultural development banks, and the ability of this knowledge to tease out exactly the climate risks that small-scale farmers have has been a mystical in fact, issue for many financial institutions, making it impossible to attract agricultural financial lending to smallholder cooperatives. And so by bringing and making banks aware of the risk profiles, this has enabled to break through and actually attract more financing into the sector. So I stop there, and my last point maybe is to just say that we are now designing, together with the country director under his leadership of the Lesotho program, borrowing and learning, of course, from Yana and Eswatini, Philippe, looking at really programming using regenerative agriculture, traceability and certification methods with the private sector. So it's a different way of designing. It's the very first time we are trying it, and this is why I was talking about new generation types of operations. and we've been talking to the private sector leaders in textiles. It's around the wool and mohair value chain competitiveness program, looking at certifying the fiber that comes from the mohair, talking to industry leads like Zara, etc. We're willing to actually give more money to the wool and mohair producers in Lesotho, as long as they achieve the parameters of this certification and traceability. And so it's going to be a very interesting learning for us as we introduce and change the standards for traceability and regenerative agriculture in general in the confines of Lesotho. I stop here and hand back to you, Nanti.
Thank you so much for that response, the rich information content and examples of within country knowledge exchanges that helped improve performance as well as inter-country within SR. If I may invite Russia and also make a plea to also, if possible, highlight not only within your region, there are attempts to capture or exchange inter-regional exchanges to promote knowledge and to the knowledge exchanges and improve performance. If you have any instances, it'll be great to hear from that as well. Over to you, Rasha.
Thank you, Nanti. So on your question about, cross-fertilization across regions, I think the example that I've just, what I've referred to earlier about the how to do note that is being developed with the Brazil office just shows you basically the broker role of our SKD department, because it's PMI, because of their overview on the overall program, they were able also to put us in touch with other relevant experiences so that this can be documented and shared more widely for dry land, integrating climate risks, especially when you're doing development programming in dry land areas. I believe there would be more at the level of IFAD, especially because of this ongoing discussion about the measurement of climate resilience or resilience to shocks, and the availability of various tools now within IFAD to be able to do so. And Joe had mentioned it earlier as well, that this is going to be an event in June. So I guess that also highlights the role that a division like or a department like SKD plays in terms of facilitating this cross-regional knowledge. And again, it's an important role that the project team leads and PDT members play. Now, in terms of the lessons learned for our program, and I must say that when we're designing program for Sudan, for example, we always also look at the neighboring countries like Chad, and we see that there's a lot of learning that we can take from there and incorporate because of the similarity, let's say, of the environmental and social contexts. So the first lesson that we have derived from the program, and as it relates to natural, let's say, climate change adaptation, is that climate change adaptation is key when you're talking, when you're working in dryland areas. Climate change adaptation is key to rural poverty alleviation. And I believe that probably explains why this has been factored into the design of the project much earlier than when the CCAP was updated or formulated, CCAP procedures formulated in IFAD. The other thing that we have learned is that because climate change affects the resource base of the rural poor, one important aspect that needs to be acknowledged in policies is that the rural poor have entitlements and rights to co-manage these resources with the government. So rangeland resources, forest resources, stock routes are usually considered as open access resources, but they have users, and these users need to be fully involved in their management. They also generate revenues, whether from water, from rangeland, from forests, which also need to be, equitably shared between the users and the government. So that's something that we have learned, and all the programs, ongoing and future ones, have this important aspect of negotiating the co-management arrangements and the sharing of resource revenues from the natural resources among the users and the government. The second aspect that we have learned is, again, working in dry lands, water is a key entry point. What we are seeing is that we need to push the boundaries of what we do in water investments and really move towards exploring much more supplementary irrigation aspects in rain-fed agriculture. And there are various surface water harvesting techniques. When we did a stock take of climate change adaptation solutions in the agriculture sector in Sudan, we looked at different experiences from NGOs and other donors, and we see that already this is emerging as a new investment area, which we should also be, financing more than what we have done so far. The third solution that we have, or the third lesson learned, that we have derived from the ongoing experience is that adaptation solutions are turning to be more expensive than the conventional practices of the smallholder farmers. This also comes back to the point that Sarah was mentioning. Access to finance becomes extremely important in these conditions. But what we have learned is that usually arrangements for access to finance end up being sorted out by the midterm of the programs or the projects. We need to make sure that this is sorted out from the very beginning, from year one. So there's quite a lot more negotiation that needs to happen with the partner financial institutions so that the arrangements are in place early on. We've spoken about risk aversion of the partner financial institutions, but now for a country like Sudan, we have a track record of 10 years to show that they can invest safely in this sector. And in very adverse conditions of hyperinflation and other. These are the lessons that we have learned and that we are, pushing in the context of the ongoing project or new interventions. Over.
Thank you so much, Rasha. May I invite Pate to complement this, particularly any examples that you can bring in from your vast experience in terms of promoting knowledge exchanges across regions and IFAD as a global entity and how well they are influencing the designs. It'll be useful to get examples of that as well, in addition to whatever else you may want to state. I want to alert that we are running very close to the end time, so if you could keep your answers as brief as possible, it'll be much appreciated. Over to you, Pate. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much, and very quickly, and what makes sometimes big institutions very influential, it's not only about money, particularly when you talk about World Bank, but ideas. And when we talk about ideas, it's the knowledge which we produce on a daily basis. And that knowledge helps to influence direction, design, implementation, policy reforms, and so on. So what we've learned over the past years between our region and also the different other regions and IFAD as a whole is some of our, number one is the tools we design. Let's say, for example, CARD, which is a tool that help us to project climate finance and also the impact of climate in the investment and what it's gonna be on the yield. So that tool is now a corporate tools, which has started with WCA, now implemented in all regions. So you have the model for all regions, and not only IFAD now use it, but AFDB, IFAD, all those institutions reach out to us when they're designing climate finance, the GCF, and they are asked to go to IFAD and try to use that tool, which is a good thing. And I think we pilot it and develop it, and now we are moving forward. So on adaptation fund, when we develop a certain number of projects, we've been approached by many institutions outside IFAD to come to us and to see how we were able to design specific project on fragile context, and we are sharing that one. Number three is on analytical and advisory support, which I believe we're still weak on, the economic and of ecosystem, of climate change. Now we're in the private sector. We need to have some people who are more like climate economists and so on, internally as part of the organizational structure that produce that information, so we can also support this one. The fourth one is on decentralization. Most of our PDT members, the experience we've had, sometimes they're just in their region. So over the last past years, we have sent some of our colleagues in this region that went to ESA to support design, which was well appreciated, and they've learned. So I think that could be also integrated in the way we do business to share cross-sector coordination, and people go outside the region, learn from the other region, so it can be included in their PES as part of their learning path and see something else. The last one would be more on policy brief, which it's more like a suggestion, and we had a discussion with Joe. In some organization, some policy brief which capture all these knowledge, good practices from the different regions can be packaged in a way on a quarterly basis. They are sent to all country directors and their team. So it could be on a specific topic on adaptation. And if we imagine one day that IFAD is an adaptation institution, so how can we produce that knowledge, which whenever you go online and click, you will see IFAD with the good practices that are being produced. And I believe those kind of policy brief will go beyond just the design, but influence the policy direction at the country, the different policy reform, the national adaptation plan, national development, local plans, which will really have a more impact than just the investment we are doing. I'll stop there and thanks.
Thank you so much for keeping it brief and also providing excellent summaries of different ways in which the organization can collaborate, coordinate among regions to strengthen the project designs as well as policy engagement. Over to Indran.
Thank you very much. Just on time, it's been an extremely rich discussion. And we appreciate the inputs that have come through from management and from Lanti for your leadership in bringing this together and galvanizing the efforts. But also, we had a very good turnout, over 60 participants online, including member states and other agencies. And this shows the interest. I think quite often in events like this is when the thinking is triggered and the examples come. If not, if we were to try to get it the other way, it doesn't really come. So there's a lot of new information that's on the table. IOE will transcribe what's come through and put together a report. We do believe it can be used at multiple levels, also linking it with Alexander into our social media so that we can have short pieces that actually help with the dissemination, not only of today's events, but on the various thematic elements that are here. But to thank all of you once again for your participation. We appreciate your valuable time. We hope we move to full events quite soon. And with that, I have pleasure in bringing the event to closure. We will share the information. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you again, participants. Thank you for your support and time. Over.
Thank you.